Good morning and welcome everybody to Turning the Key with myself, Patrick, and my co-host, Sean. We are on episode 5 today, and we're going to be talking about the 7th hexagram in the I Ching, in the gene keys, the key of virtue, the Siddhi of virtue, the gift of guidance, the shadow of division. So for anybody who's listening and watching, one of the initial ways to get your feet wet in this conversation would be to explore this experience or this concept of division, particularly around relationships, where you may have felt divisive energy in your life more immediately, divisive energy in the world, the energy that kind of keeps humans kind of behind the scenes, suspicious of one another and separate from one another. So we're going to be talking today about themes of gossip, hidden agendas, the energy that has the power to both create and destroy armies, literally. And so welcome, Sean, and excited to be here with you this morning.
Thank you. Yeah, this is a powerful key. Like you said, in the traditional I Ching, it's often named the army. And it's also shi, S-H-I. I know I'm pronouncing that wrong with the tonal expression in Chinese, but in its ancient form, it's also called multitude. And when you look at the ideograph from I think the Bronze era, it's on the right is the multitude, and then a picture for pivot or circle. And so it's like, how does that pivoting in relationship to multitude? There's two ways: either that the multitude will divide and go around that circle, or the multitude will pivot as a unit and move together as a whole. And as you're talking about the division of the shadow of division, how do we divide our community, in response to our own fears and needs and wants, wittingly or unwittingly? How do we become divided in our society, which I think is a super powerful thing to look at right now as we speak in society. And the things that do worm their way in, especially into our unconscious, and literally get to the center of our physical existence to either directly threaten or feel like a threat to our survival and our ability to own and take up space. Where are the things that divide us? And then where do we rise into the gift? Where are the things that are guiding us? Who are the people who are guiding us? Where in our own felt sense do we receive our guidance so that we actually stay whole and we stay cohesive or communicative within our multitude, within our communities? And a really good example of this is actually cancer, is when a group of cells divide themselves off from the whole, meaning they're no longer being able to receive cellular communication in a healthy way. They're no longer able to connect into the system's ability to bring in nutrients and to take away waste, or somehow they wall themselves off and divide themselves. Now they just reproduce for reproduction, sake alone, and they just consume, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger until they overwhelm the whole system.
Wow.
And so that and then when you look at cities, when you look at different human systems, especially around economy and distributions of wealth, power, and resources, we see in many ways how that division creates a cancer-like condition on in our planet.
It's interesting. I was looking up before this podcast, I was just looking up the word legion, because in some I Ching interpretations, it's the 7th hexagram is called legion, in others the army. But I think the first definition hit for legion is specifically linked to like a Roman, like the Roman Empire, and like maybe the term well, who knows if the term originated, around then or not, but there was a distinction around like a Roman army. And when I think of this key of virtue in this hexagram, to me, it's really the energy that throughout history has given rise and demise to empires. And so when you think of like the fall of the Roman Empire and, the internal division that had to take place in order to split apart this just the grandeur of this society, of this army, to be able to kind of self-implode. And I think it's also important to begin with the talk of this key around our relationship with the concept of an alpha, a leader, because we're going to be talking a lot today about our relationship with leadership, and specifically this hexagram, and spoken of within the gene keys. It carries the mark of the alpha, like the genetic imprint of the alpha. So we look to certain people as guides in life, and that there's something about the way that some people speak or present their knowledge about a topic, or really just even beyond that, there's something in the aura of certain people where we look to them as, that's somebody who I want to listen to, that's somebody who I want to follow. And we may not be able to exactly pinpoint why, but there's a magnetism around that individual. And that is not just reserved, of course, to people who have spiritual maturity. As we look at the state of the world and world leaders, there are qualities that are present where we look towards certain individuals, and there's some sort of a magnetism, even though some of the language that's emerged or the actions that come out may be quite divisive, purely. And so why is that, and why do we lean into following certain individuals? And so I'd like to begin with an entry point just around our relationship with this concept of the alpha and following an alpha, and what carrying that trait might lead someone to do or not do in terms of how they lead others. Because if there's a self-serving agenda around how you lead, and a conscious or unconscious acknowledgement of your carrying of that sort of magnetism and that trait, this starts to get into that field of the shadow of division that we're talking about, where consciously, or most often unconsciously, that trait is wielded in a way to be able to kind of build armies, build legions of followings through your capacity to influence others. And then how do you, as you grow your influence and as you grow your army, maintain your seat of power? And this, and I'd like to begin by speaking into that, and like how division starts to fester out and ultimately cause the collapse of the empire.
Exactly right.
When the charade is up.
There's so much. There's
a lot to talk about with this one,
especially with the state of the world right now. And in the I Ching, as I have reviewed it and as it's spoken to me, the use of the army has a nuance to it, in such of, it's like not just there's an army, but there's a standing army. that there is professional soldiers, basically, whose only job is to be a soldier. And really, in ancient times in China, there was no standing army. There was only farmers that when there was a need for an army, they got, conscripted into the army. And that, I'll speak to that in a bit, because that has a nuance in and of itself that really speaks to this hexagram. But I think it's really important that we all feel into, as far as division in our life, how much is that tied to the standing army that we keep within our own armoring? Like, do you walk around in the world with a standing army? Do you walk around into the world like expecting, projecting, and almost welcoming the conflict, and how much of your own upbringing did you need to have that as a survival mechanism? And how much right now do you need to release that army, right? So that your internal energy can go back to farming, can go back to creating nourishment, to go back to becoming a husband to the land. You know what I mean? And to the natural processes within our body. Because when you have a standing army, that consumes so much resources, right? And it consumes so much need for leadership, because once you have a standing army and their sole purpose is to conquer, kill, and dominate, then it's really hard to control that. And once the leadership is gone and the multitude is now thinking for itself, that's all it will do, because that's its program. You know what I mean? And so when your leadership of your heart isn't front and center, then the leadership of your survival mechanism is now moving forward, and your army is now just charging forward, ready to conquer and to take. And so that has a very subtle, unconscious motivation into any relationship that you enter into. How can I be alpha here? How can I either commandeer or command or take over the resources, whether it's emotional, social, financial, whatever it may be, and how much that is now considered to be a virtue in the business world. Like a good CEO, is an alpha. And I would even go as far, I know it's changing now, but I'd go as far as saying a good CEO is actually a bully, someone who does divide, someone who does just take, someone who does exploit, you know what I mean? And in the corporate empire, right? Like you are rewarded by your savvy of how much you can make other people work for you, so you work less. So you devalue the other person's work, and then you extract that value from them. It's like basic, playground rules. That's not fair. How we want to raise our kids, we would say, no, that's not fair. Everybody shares. And if you contribute to a certain energy, then you get your fair share of that, that the contribution yields. So I'll eventually circle back, because there's so much in the actual hexagram itself with earth over water. But I feel, I want to pass it off to you for a second, because I think it's just important for us to hold what it means to have a standing army, how much that has been our definition of the United States, our military might, and really what that has brought into the world as far as an industrialized war machine,
Yeah. The army, it's like the expression of might throughout the planet has been, for however long, tied to the size of your military, the size of the military budget. And we're literally watching this play out right before our very eyes. And one thing that I want to bring in a couple of terms around all this, because it's like, where does it all start with me as an individual? And to me, the shadow of division, it starts with a couple of key terms that we'll keep coming back to. It starts with gossip. It starts with covert agendas and manipulation. And that can be unconscious manipulation. But it's through that cocktail. And I'm going to start with gossip. Especially in a time like right now where, you could look at the United States and liberal or conservative, people who are pro-attacking Iran or against attacking Iran, or pro-Russia or pro-Ukraine. There's all of these splits: blue, red, black, white. It goes on and on and on. And the more that we individually stew in this frequency of connecting with somebody else and speaking with them about how much the other side, the other color, the other country, the other ideology has it wrong, is the root seed that literally gives rise to the military industrial complex.
And how they pervert virtue by saying, I'm right, this is right, my God is right, my declaration is right, my virtue is the virtue that God recognizes.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And this is where it can feel, and I'm going to just speak from my own personal experience with this, as someone who grew up more in the camp of the non-popular camp in school, to at some point start to be welcomed into dialogue where there's this sense of like, oh, I'm feeling validated by somebody who I sort of look up to now because I'm speaking the lingo with them around how much we know better than someone else, than some other group of people, than some other ideology, anything like that. My work with this key was really locating that feel-good sense of like, they don't know what the F they're talking about, like they're so wrong. Yeah, we're gonna stomp out that virus of that mentality or whatever it is. All the stuff, you don't have to look far. You just go on x.com or you go on Instagram and you'll see it immediately. That sort of feel-good sense of like, I'm on the right side, is that root seed that festers and puts up all these borders and creates literally yourself and the other and that whole collection of people who identify with that ideology into an army. It is building the ranks of that army that then must go and do war with that other group through social media comments, through throwing bricks in the street, through literally grabbing, piloting Apache helicopters and dropping bombs, right? So it starts with that whispering of who's right, who's more virtuous in their knowing, in their campaign, in their ideology. And so it can be really tempting, especially if you've felt kind of like, not like an alpha in your life, where then you feel like, well, I'm feeling this sense of self-empowerment by aligning with this ideology, and I'm going to start to weave people into this ideology with me so I can feel this sense of this like sense of guidance that like I'm a leader and I know what I'm talking about and look at me. but ultimately it's creating division. It's trying to stomp something else out that at its core is coming from a wound, is coming from its own pain. It's coming from its own, at its deepest level, division, separation from its connection with oneness, divinity, unity with all of life.
And ultimately rooted in fear. And I think this is like a huge place of how we're moving as human beings, is that we're now collectively on the planet where we have the know-how, we have the collective wisdom, we have the technology, where survival no longer needs to be our primary concern as human beings. Like we would be able to feed every single human on the planet. We would be able to manage natural resources. And more than anything, we'd be able to safeguard our soil and our water. And this brings me to the hexagram that we're working with right now, which is earth over water. And this it ties in so beautifully in so many ways. And first, when you think of earth over water, it talks about this primary resource. And if you've ever been out camping, if you've ever been out, especially in a dry, arid space, food is one thing, but water is primary. Air is, we need that every second, but we don't live in water. So air is readily available. If you don't have the air, you're not going to be there. But water is the second. And if you don't have clean, fresh water, then there's a problem. Like you can't really be there for long. And certainly you cannot, hold up a multitude. You can't have a gathering, because the more scarce the water, the less people can be in one place to thrive on it. And so earth over water, one speaks to an aqueduct, an underground stream. And when you have an aqueduct, like in Arizona, up on Black Mesa, like it's super dry, it can be very hot, very arid, but underneath Black Mesa, where is the indigenous land of the Hopi and then the Dene or the Navajo, that this aqueduct provided so much clean, fresh water that civilizations were able to thrive. And so when you have this underground resource of water that is going to be consistent for you, that is not going to respond to flooding and droughts and other things, that it's just this held source of resource, that is something that would inspire raising an army to protect, and that a multitude of people gathers around. And then once that becomes threatened, people's survival mechanisms kick in, Go ahead.
Which I was just going to say is interesting, because in the savannah, and you go to a watering hole in the savannah, and it's almost like the safe ground. The lions are there next to the gazelles, and everybody's got this hidden code that's just like, this is there. And it's so interesting that you bring up that detail, because it's that perversion in the human story of here's this precious resource that we need to survive, and how do we smite anybody else who might want to take it from us? And then you look at the animal kingdom, and it's like, I could easily go over there and just capture that gazelle. I'm hungry, actually, but this is greater than me. This is the enther ecosystem's survivability right here. And so we're going to honor that.
Everybody drinks. It levels the field. And this speaks directly to this concept of alpha and the human governmental leadership that perverts it. And this idea of survival of the fittest, if you really look back into Darwin's writings, and where that was extracted from the Galapagos, being on essentially a pirate ship, if you want to call it that, or you can call it or a government sanctioned ship to expand the empire. But basically, the survival of the fittest worked and was accepted because it was a way to explain that if I was able to dominate you, then God is on my side because I'm stronger than you. You know what I mean? If I can dominate you, then you are subordinate to me. And that was one way that Christian, love thy neighbor, love is God type of society could stomach colonization and essentially a systematic rape, pillage, and plunder of the indigenous world. And it came from this idea that because I can dominate you, that means I'm actually superior to you, which makes me actually the human being and you the animal. So just like I keep cows and pigs and chickens and I till the field and I assert my dominance on that, then I'm superior to that. And then if I can do that to you, then I'm superior to you. And it's actually God is telling me to try to bring you up to my level, which is really fucked up. But that was the thinking that needed to be like literally, that was the virtue, right? That needed to be perverted for people to actually accept in their hearts that this was okay. You know what I mean? And that the empire was good, And like we're feeling the effects of that right now so strongly, and it's going to reverberate into history. When really the truth is, and this has been, confirmed and supported like by the highest scientific journal out there, Nature, that the true, and we've spoken about this before, that the true law of the jungle is mutual aid. That really it's about resource sharing and resource management, and that the mortal coil of predation is actually a piece of that. It's a piece of managing life and then the energy of life. And that predation is actually eliminating the sick and the old and the things that aren't actually adding to this virility of the whole ecosystem. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I love how we've been speaking about kind of that originating hierarchical impulse that starts that divisive campaign. And then because that division is there, and because that division is the antithesis to life, ultimately, the division starts to, the shadow, the way that it starts to work is it starts to, well, in my experience, it starts to then need to preserve itself. And so if it is clearly destructive to the ecosystem to dominate the watering hole, but I don't want everybody else to see that, then I need to start to build with influence people to see that my acts and my behaviors of conquest, of dominance, are actually for their own benefit. And so how do I do that? I do that through selling a very compelling agenda, and by separating them all off, dividing them all from one another. So if I can go, let's play with like, an upside down savanna energy. Here I am, the lion, and I go over to the elephants and I say, hey, look, there's not a lot of water here. And I know that you drink a lot. And you know who else drinks a lot? Are the gazelles.
And the hyenas. They're super.
And the hyenas. Those hyenas, they drink a lot. They're really greedy. Yeah, I mean, you see what they do when we when we slay a
Yeah,
gazelle, they
right.
want to come in and take it. Oh yeah, they do drink a
Right.
lot. There are
And
a
they're
lot of
kind of
them here.
ugly, you know what I mean? And they're
So
greedy.
yeah,
Like all,
yeah,
all they think about is
exactly.
themselves.
And the noise that they make, and
Terrible
it's
music.
just we're trying
Terrible
to
music.
sleep.
They're up
Yeah,
all
it's
night.
so bad, you know. But you know what? There's not enough of us to kind of block them out. But I know that they are really intimidated by how
Right.
big you are. So if you elephants just kind of spread out around the watering hole, they're not going to be as tempted to kind of come in when we're all trying to drink. And then the elephants are like, okay,
that makes sense.
that sounds, that makes sense.
Right.
That makes sense. Let's do it. And so then the lions are like, great. Thank you so much for being on, for seeing that. It means a lot to me. And then the lions go over and they go to the hyenas.
Like, those fucking elephants.
And they say, those elephants, I know that their population is really increasing. And, the thing is that when they're in a pack together, you can't really do anything about it, because how are you going to go after the baby? They're too big.
Fat, they're lazy.
But I bet that if you grouped together and if you found one of them separate from the others, then one by one you could take about, and it's literally like that. And it's just funny, and I love how organically that came together. But that is that division energy, where that alpha trait goes and seeds division to perpetuate ultimately its own agenda of, I want all the water, and I want all the meat, and I want all of this resource for myself. And I also, at some level in this, am getting off a little bit by my ability to kind of weave in the shadows and feel that feeling of like I'm in control. I'm leading people, I'm really being looked at upon as a guide, and people are leaning into me as that. What are you going to say?
It's so right on. Because really, if I divide the elephants and the hyenas against each other and pit them against each other, now their energy is never looking back on me, right? Because they're so consumed.
Yeah.
Because now the elephants have their campaign and the hyenas have their campaign. And they're all actually working on the virtue that I've seeded within them. And this works in society very insidiously, and it actually comes from a form of pedagogy where we indoctrinate children into the virtue of the society. And I don't know if anybody who's listening has ever stood in a classroom, or if you are a teacher, or if you've ever worked with a group of people, especially children. You come to the awareness that basically they have the power. The multitude has the power. That if they all worked as one, you couldn't do anything about it. So the way that classical pedagogy has accepted that is that they divide the classroom. They give a certain amount of privilege to a certain amount of the kids, right? That privilege is like stars on the board, or you do such a good job, these little rewards for actually doing and obeying and doing the things the teacher wants them to do. Then another part of the classroom doesn't have the privilege. They're usually the ones that don't speak the language well, that have come in from an outside source, that look different, act different. So it's really easy to point out that difference. The gross hyenas that are yapping and yelling and like, what the hell are they doing, So there's already this place of like, who's that? What are they doing? And if you look at a child, their natural reaction to difference is curiosity. If a child sees another child with a different color of skin, they want to go up and touch it. They want to go explore it. It's like, wow, if they feel safe because their parents are there and there isn't this like tense frequency of fear, then actually difference of division, difference inspires curiosity and attraction, which is, I think, is an important naturally. So anyways, when the teacher is now they pit the classroom against each other, And every once in a while, the teacher will take privilege away from one of the privileged, will revoke those certain, stars and the this and the that, and they show the whole classroom that if you're privileged, you can lose it. And every once in a while, they give privilege to one of the disenfranchised. And then all of a sudden, it's like, whoa, I can actually gain that. So now the privileged, they might feel a little guilty. They might feel a little, like this isn't fair, but they see how shitty it is on the other side of the of the line. And now they're scared that they might lose what they have. Then the disenfranchised are so like in a state of scarcity and in a state of their own like need to survive that they can't, like, that's like going back to the deafness. There's too much overwhelm that they can't even hear what's really going on. And all they want is just to taste that privilege, even though it is highly manufactured and essentially a fantasy. And then once the classroom is divided against each other, now the teacher can stand with impunity and be able to really guide that class into where they want to take them, And if you really look at our society and you look at privilege, you can kind of see it's almost the same thing.
This is, for anybody listening, this is welcome to our society. This is what it is, and as it's been, and it's like this time that we're in where even those who are leaning into spirituality and spiritual awakening and all of this, that there can still be that trap there. That's like the us versus them. We're the chosen ones who get it and who see. And those people who are asleep, they just don't. And so how does that then create this sense of moral superiority, this like false sense of virtue of who's better than someone else? And I see it so much in this campaign that, and I've been a part of this also, because when I look at enough of the lies and the deceit and the state of our food system and our healthcare system and the education system and all this stuff, it's like there can really be this sense, if you start to see behind the scenes of the weird, perverted, distorted, destructive, even insidious, definitely insidious, behaviors that are underlying some of that stuff, there's this energy that can want to come up that's like, burn it all to the ground. Burn it all to the ground. And then, at some level, bless the curiosity of the conspiracy theorists who ask questions and are exploring. But when that also starts to take on an energy and an ego that's like, we're the ones that see, and so therefore we're the ones that are better, it's feeding the same thing. You're just creating another army. If you don't ever, then this is probably a good time to start to look into, the gift of guidance. If you're not using what you see as a way to guide from the heart in service people towards some higher virtue, that is, we all want clean drinking water for all humans. We all want food that doesn't make us sick. We all want to be able to receive aid and care medically when our health is deteriorating or in jeopardy. We all want to live in an environment where we have access to the resources that we need to thrive, and also warmth and comforts that allow for us to feel cared for. And even beyond that, opportunities and community that give us access to creativity and opportunities to also lead with our own gifts And it's like that space of how can I lead people to the watering hole that supports, to that fountain of life, to the spring that nurtures and nourishes all of us, and not be so tempted into separating out and taking away the privileges, or shaming or punishing or demonizing the one who seems to be, messing that up.
Exactly.
And therefore raising an army with others to try to smite
Exactly.
that
And
one.
further divide. And I love how you said that. We all want water. We all want food. We all want health. Basically health and wealth, you know what I mean? Whereas like wealth is really resources, and a state
Mm-hmm.
of a calm, centered is an important piece, nervous system. And on top of that, we want to all sit down at the banquet table together and share it in community. Like there's one thing about
Mm-hmm.
having all your needs met, but if you're alone and isolated, you can eat like a king every day, but you'll still be lonely. You'll still feel that scarcity. You'll still feel that
Amen.
poverty. But really, true wealth comes in the sharing of the resources and seeing other people thrive and seeing other people rise along with you. And I think that's the
Mm-hmm.
true place. And again, looking at the hexagram, there's 6 lines in a hexagram. But if you look at it, there's actually 7 spaces with the top and the bottom, and that accommodates the human chakra system. So the second line is the second chakra, but it's also the middle of the lower trigram, which goes with earth, which goes with our first 3 primal centers, which is basically feeding, fucking, and fighting, right? Getting your own space, being able to nourish yourself. And then the middle of that is having the safety to actually procreate, right? And share your creative energy. Now, at a lower frequency, fear is so important in that. And water, the emotion that resonates with the phase of water is fear. And this is the ocean. This is where all life comes from, is this dark, primal, instinctual place, right? And so at its base level, that survival is so important, and that fear keeps us alive, keeps us moving forward. But it's a base instinct, right? And what it does though
Mm-hmm.
is when you look at the hexagram, all the lines are receptive, all the lines are open, all the lines are receiving. The only one that's projecting out
Mm-hmm.
is the second line, which is the center of your physical existence. And in any martial art, traditional martial art warrior culture, what you develop first is that center. You develop your hara, or you develop your dantian. You develop your pelvic
Mm-hmm.
center of gravity. So you hold your center, primary in all your movements, all your vocalization, all your power is actually coming from this yang radiating place. And that, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense, is guidance. Like our primary guidance is tuning into the center of our physical existence. And the first thing that the alarm bells are going to ring is when your actual physical safety is threatened. You know what I mean? And so people leverage that in order to create that division. Just like you said, with the lions and the hyenas and the elephants, it all came around water. Like, do you have enough water? Do you think you have enough water? But what if,
Mm-hmm.
it starts seeding
Yeah.
these fear tactics. But really, like going back
Mm-hmm.
to ancient China and how the armies were conscripted from the farmers, that especially Xing Yi, which is one of the most classical forms of Chinese martial arts that outdates Tai Chi, Bagua, and a lot of the other Shaolin based martial arts, was a farmer's martial art. And the movements came from chopping, swinging, chopping an axe. It came from sawing. It came from pushing. It came
Mm-hmm.
from sifting grain, and it came from baling hay.
Mm-hmm.
And all those movements created martial expressions that were then applied to the battlefield with either spears, swords, and shields. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? And the thing is that when you
Mm-hmm.
do those movements every day, you build a very strong center and you learn how to move from your center. And that's very important because it applies to martial, like direct battle application. But we're also talking about how do you become an army of one? How do you actually center yourself in such a
Mm-hmm.
cohesive way that your own multitude of trillions of cells, even more trillions of microorganisms living
Mm-hmm.
in balance with you, ideally, and how does that all center itself in your own physical presence? And how does that guide you? Because what happens is when the people with the strongest center actually becomes a central point for the multitude. The people who center themselves the strongest in their own presence then attracts, because again, the middle of that centering is our creative sexual magnetism, that then attracts other people
Mm-hmm.
that then constellate around that center. And that center can
Mm-hmm.
be firmed, can be held through fear. But the higher way to develop that, which is really expressed in Chinese classical martial arts, is through relaxation, is through
Mm-hmm.
like there's a saying that you move by sitting down and you win by giving up. You give up to win, and you sit down to move. Meaning that when you relax
Mm-hmm.
and you just allow gravity to and your breath and your mind to all create that one yang line in your center, then everything else is open
Mm-hmm.
and you just respond. You don't have an agenda, right? You don't have that insidious,
Mm-hmm.
let me divide here, let me divide there. You just respond to what comes in and then you just give it out, which is there's a saying in
Mm-hmm.
samurai culture that when two masters meet, two people that have firmed their own center, they have tea, you know, because there isn't an opening and there isn't a provocation. They have no need to assert their alpha. They have no need to assert their own, formed and solidified and mastered center. So what is there to do?
Mm-hmm.
To enjoy each other, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. A couple of things that you shared that I want to expand on. When you look at the hexagram, I guess in the gene keys, in one way, that those lines are looked at is that it is from a chakra system, first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and then the seventh would be kind of like the
Yeah.
all encompassing, kind of all enveloping. So that second line would be
Yeah.
sacral
Yeah.
oriented. And when you consider alpha, that this is the archetype that carries the alpha trait. And what does the alpha want to do? It wants to spread its seed. It wants to maintain its bloodline. It wants to propagate its alpha genetic code throughout in order to ensure that its lineage army
Right.
has the water,
Yeah.
has the resources. And so that's really where you can have perversions around that. And how do you maintain that? And well, if in order to be able to do that, how can I isolate the weakest
Yeah.
links from one another, so that way there's no threat of the classroom bonding together and usurping my throne. And so throughout another lens of looking into this, which Richard speaks of in the Gene Keys, is that this archetype carries the energy of what's called the power behind the throne. And so throughout history, and even though maybe we don't associate it so much overtly today in how government operates, even though there are many that would say, oh, of course that's what it is it's this concept of like the shadow government. Who are the voices whispering in the king's and the queen's ears? And that throughout time and history, great empires, there have always been these trusted guides, people that were close, who consulted the king and the queen, who had the eyes and the ears amongst all the people, and who were able to provide them with the information so that they could rule with virtue to serve the people. Yet that level of power can be of very
Right.
very addictive. And if you are the eyes and the ears of the king and the queen, and you start to see a pathway for self-empowerment by subtly, covertly gossiping and sharing specific details around your agenda and hiding that and concealing that artfully, then you can, over time, create the conditions for your own army to take the throne. Look at Game of Thrones.
Exactly right.
Here's your template fantasy story to explore this exact thing. How does the whispering behind the throne start to create this divisive energy that creates an opening for one empire to fall, one house to fall, and another to take its place and take its resources, take its wealth, to pillage and rape and propagate its seed and its family banner. And this is happening in our world today.
Exactly.
Right now.
And historically, oftentimes the person who had the ear of the king or the emperor or the queen was the consort, the courtesan, the concubine, you know, or the queen's champion, you know, the person that actually had really had this sexual hold on the person. And how many times does our own, need for sexual fulfillment, or even not even in an explicit way of feeling creative, and then feeling like that we have this penetrative spreading of our genius, genius into the world. How much do we use that in order to divide, and oftentimes it's said that men seek power for sex and women seek sex for power. And how is that personal, kind of need go in and malalign the community around you? You know what I mean? So that you can actually feel creative and powerful, and that your own physical center has primacy. When really, there is no primacy. There's only there's the multitude is the one, Yeah.
So what do we do with this? And speaking in guidance and virtue, and knowing that there's a spectrum of alchemy here, from division through the gift of guidance to the Siddhi of virtue, the two most powerful invitations that are welcomed within the Gene Keys and Richard's just transmissions around this, which I've found so impactful for me in my life, are really twofold. One is your boundaries. How you cultivate healthy boundaries in your life so that you're not woven into other people's agendas. Being really careful around kind of who you allow into your inner circle. Who, as you, king and queen on the throne of your life, who you welcome into your inner chamber to whisper in your ear details about how you should build and navigate and orient your life and your way of relating with society and the world. So holding healthy boundaries in that space to protect your inner knowing is a big one, and protecting yourself from or just sensing covert manipulation into other hidden agendas. That's one of the first entry points that I found into this. The second one actually is really pure and extraordinarily beautiful. And Richard speaks into this, is how do you safeguard your virtue? So he gives an example. If you're in a group of people and somebody starts speaking poorly about someone else or an entire group of people, or, this culture is this, or whatever. And how do you respond in that moment? Do you indulge, or do you safeguard your virtue? Do you hold pure your virtue and not poison your waters by leaning in and being woven into that really tempting drink of division? So when we're talking about the spring the water under the earth, the spring, the font of life that brings nourishment. Where do you allow your spring to become tainted by corrupting, defiling your inner virtue, your inner spring, by engaging in that sort of behavior with others? And let me tell you, that has been both such a challenge, yet such a reward for me in my life by leaning into that more. Because if you look on social media, you've got every single reason plastered out there on billboards to want to find your own way to your rightness, to you having the most supreme virtue versus someone else, versus another group of people, versus another ideology, another country. And you'll never create the one heart of humanity by cutting off all of these other arteries that support the beating lifeblood of humanity. So check yourself next time you're sitting with people around the dinner table, or one-on-one with somebody, and where do you find yourself wanting to engage in speaking bad about somebody else or another group of people, or Republicans or Democrats or any of this stuff? Because that is where...
Sorry, I was just going to... And when you...
I was just going to say that's where it starts. That is where it all starts, is right there in those moments. It may seem so insignificant, but that is where it all separates and divides.
And the only thing that I wanted to add to that is when when you are in the safety of your own space and all you have is your phone and you don't have a direct reaction to your input into a community, and you're just posting, right? Like what is that energy? What energy are you putting into that web of essentially connection into everybody else? Yeah, I'm sorry I butted in there because you were speaking so beautifully, and it's so important. And the thing that I would love to add to that helps cultivate that space within you is two things: is when you are centered in yourself, and when you're centered in your own physical presence, meaning you're not centered in your intellect, you're not centered into this mind game of trying to understand what's going on, and even you're not...
And if I may, I'd even say your centeredness in your connection with God, with Source, with oneness, that links every single animal of the savannah in the circle of life, like centered in that.
When your body acts like an antenna for God, for the divine, and like any antenna, it needs to be grounded, it needs to be connected. And so your grounding is your physical presence, is your physical center, is your pelvis. When you really own your pelvis and you own your own self-care, like what you're saying, how do you safeguard your virtue? Like how are you centered in your own self that you feel secure, even in times of threat, which is a whole lifetime of cultivation, or lifetimes sometimes, And then the second thing is that virtue, Alan Watts speaks to this very beautifully, is that like virtue is sometimes delivered to us in this idea that it has to be cultivated. You need to study, you need to read scripture, you need to have an appreciation for philosophy, you need to be well read, you need to be experienced, and then there's virtue there. And another way of saying virtue is that a virtue of a rose is its blossom and its scent and the beautiful visual image that the rose gives. And many times in herbal medicine, a plant's virtue is its medicinal qualities, right? And I think that's very important to say, is that when we center ourselves and we hold true to what we are deeply feeling and knowing to be right, which is our heart, and when we hold our physical center with a state of concentration, a state of where the multitude of us becomes one in a common center, then our heart can beat freely and feel freely, and it doesn't have to armor. It can just be. And when we have our felt sense of knowing and we know who we are, then actually there's a flowering. There's a flowering in
Mm-hmm.
in our existence, and we share our essence with the world, which is our medicine, which is our virtue, which is our contribution
Mm-hmm.
to society. And just like the sun that just shines without any need for reciprocity, just like a flower that offers its scent to anybody and anything that passes its by, then we do the same thing. We can just be ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and in our being of our essential nature, we contribute and we also receive. We're a part of a natural system that balances itself. Like we don't have to work so hard, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's right
And
there in the
right
cells
there.
of our bodies,
Yeah.
in the organs. The heart isn't trying to dominate
No.
the spleen, you know, and the brain, well, the mind, but the brain isn't trying to snuff out the
Right.
liver. It's working together. It's a cohesive unit. And so, Sean, I loved our
Yeah.
chat today. I thought you kept it off so beautifully and
Thank
so
you.
poetically. So, I'm gonna say, well, let's
Okay.
wrap it up there. And thank you, everybody who's joining with us this week and listening to this. An invitation for you, like we've been saying, is really exploring your virtue in your life. What are when you think about your dream for a world of everybody having their watering hole needs met, everybody being able to live in connection and inspiration and creation with one another, how can you come back to the root of that within yourself and treasure that feeling within yourself? And if you notice campaigns or attempts or gossip or conversation that seeks to try to pin people against one another, where can you use that as an opportunity to guide yourself back into
Right.
your center and hold and nurture that virtue and allow for that virtue to flower all upon its own, even if you don't know how that's going to happen? You trust in that seed of that intention, of that pure intention in your heart, and you allow for that to speak from the
Yes.
podium. And next week, we're going to be coming back. We're going to be speaking about the pair to the 7th hexagram, which is the 13th hexagram. And in the gene keys, that is the key of empathy, the shadow of discord, the gift of discernment.
Wow.
So we're going to be speaking
Right.
even further into the relationship of that whole archetype with this one, and how the best guides are ultimately the ones who listen the best to the needs of
Exactly.
the people. And so thank you all for
you so
joining
much.
us today, and we'll
Okay.
see you next
Bye.
week.